Okay. So, yeah, good morning, and thank you very much for the invitation. And I'm taking the chance to present today our gallery on colonialism in our new permanent exhibition. So on October 25th, our museum, our permanent gallery was reopened after a closing time for almost 14 years. And when we start 5 years ago thinking about the concept of the permanent galleries, it became clear from the very beginning that we want to focus also on the colonial history of our collections and of our institution. And this is a little bit not so easy because here you can see the entrance of our museum. Our museum is located in the Neue Burg, which was the castle of the Austrian emperor family. And so I think always that the architecture of our museum is very important because when visitors are entering the museum, this kind of architecture is maybe giving them some feeling, yeah, what they're expecting. And of course, in Vienna, we have this tourism of the Habsburger. And so I can imagine that some people are just admiring the architecture, even if it's also part of the colonial, of the imperial power. So in our permanent gallery, we have 4 entrances, and we decided to give the space for the gallery on colonialism at one of these entrances, so that we hope that when the visitor is entering the exhibition through the gallery on colonialism, it will shape a little bit how he will receive also the other galleries in the museum. Okay, this is the ground plan of the gallery. The gallery was titled In the Shadow of Colonialism, and it was very difficult to decide how we should deal with this thematical point. And I think I was something like the leading curator of a team of 4 different curators from different areas. And I wrote 4 different concepts before I get the support of the chief curator Barbara Plankensteiner and our director Steven Engelsmann to say, okay, this is how we want to deal with it. The third concept was indeed a concept where we said, okay, we want to tell the story from the colonized people's point of view and not from our point of view. But then the director and the chief curator decided that we should focus on the colonial history of our institution. And so you see there are many different ways of making a gallery on colonialism in an ethnographic museum. You always have to decide and you have to leave something out. But I said, okay, we can do this, and I'm writing a next concept. But I said, when we are dealing with the past of our institution, I also want to deal with the present of our institution. So we cannot really talk about colonialism just in the past without asking what we are learning from these things for our own curatorial practice. And so the room has different thematical areas. We have an introduction wall where we try to give in 1,200 signs what is colonialism and what does it mean for our museum. That was really a big challenge. And we also made some interviews with colleagues from other museums, also with Cunera here from the museum in Leiden, where they explain what is colonialism today, why is it important to talk about it, and why is the Ethnographic Museum a good place to talk about it. So this is a kind of introduction for the visitor. And then we have 3, we call them Symmetrical Walls, dealing with the historical past of our collection. And we have 3 Symmetrical Walls where we are dealing with the question of decolonizing the museum practice. And we have 1 thematical area. It's on the right side, on the bottom, where we have still included a little bit this idea of that also the colonized people are telling these stories, where we have engravings on bamboo from the Neue Hebriden, where the colonized people depicting the arrival of the colonizer and how they established plantation and all of these things. Yeah, so it's still in our mind that, of course, there is another point of view of telling these stories. So here you can see on the right the engravings on bamboo. On the left and on the right, you see the introduction wall, and in the middle is a world map where we're asking if independence is really the end of colonialism. And this is a wall we are still working on. It's a lot of mistakes. And I think one of the biggest mistakes we made is that we use the Mercator projection to show the world. And when we make the correction, when we will make the correction of the other mistakes, for example, that Mozambique was get independence in our card from the British Empire and not from the Portuguese, we will also change the projection of the world to make an irritation for the visitor and to let him think about how we see the world. So this will change maybe in April. Okay, so here are the first 3 symmetrical walls. I think like in Denmark, we had a little bit the problem that some of our visitors and the public thinks that colonialism has nothing to do with Austria. Especially one of our former cultural ministers said that our museum should not deal with colonialism because there is no connection to the Austrian Empire and to the Austrian state, and this is not important. And so we said, okay, first we have to explain to the visitor why or what is the connection between Austria and colonialism. And that lead us to the concept of the room that we are asking questions. So the thematical areas are organized by questions, and we giving some information for the visitor so the visitor can think about the questions, but we not try to answer the questions totally. And one of my colleagues from Tervuren said, oh my God, this is a very easy way to go into the thematical area of colonialism, just asking questions, yeah? But I think we need to find, or we had to find an easy way for the visitor to enter this area. And when questions are an easy way, I think it's a good way to engage the visitor with this thematical area. So we have the question, what has Austria to do with colonialism? And we are showing some pieces of our collection explain that, for example, of course, Austria had colonies in the late 18th century, like the Nicobars, the Andaman Island, and also a little place in Mozambique. But that maybe because the navy was not so successful or that Austria was too engaged in East Europe, the non-European colonialism was not so important for Austria, and so there became more collaboratives. For example, Austrian citizens worked for the Germans in East Africa, and so they were, of course, engaging in this thing. And we already heard that the colonial project was something beyond national borders, yeah. And so the colonial mind was, of course, also existing in the Austrian public, and so this is discussed at that point. The other 2 thematical walls are related to each other. It's about the acquisition of objects and how they came into our museum. This is, by the way, the main narrative in the whole permanent gallery. How came the objects to Austria, and what kind of relationship between the world and Austria is inscribed in our collection. So here we're really asking the questions if the objects were exchanged, presented, looted, robbed, stolen. And we have one example. This is the Austrian, I forgot the surname. This is the first name. The surname is Baumann. He was working for the German government in East Africa. And here you can see how colonial expansion and the acquiring of the object goes in many ways parallel on the map and in the time. And so, but on the other way, for example, there were objects presented, but, for example, presented by a slave trader. Yeah, so it's not just because it was a present, there is no colonial past of the object, but of course it is in some way attached to this. The other example comes from New Ireland. It's an example of the Malangan objects, and here we have another very different a different case study where the indigenous people selling a lot of objects which were formerly destroyed after the ritual use to get agency again with the colonial power. So we see that was also a very, for us, an important point to show that indigenous people were not only, not merely victims in the time of colonialism, but they also tried to find ways to get back their agency. So here you can see how it looks today. And here are the 3 symmetrical walls dealing with the decolonization of museum practice. And this was the first one that was really difficult to discuss, also with a group of curators working on this gallery. It is a question how we are collecting today. And I said, I would like to discuss a collecting trip I did on my own in 2005 to the Zamunda in Suriname. And when I'm looking back right now, I think, oh my God, that was a totally colonial project. And my collecting trip was not so different what other people did 100 years or 150 years ago. Yeah, it was still in a situation of inequality. I were visiting very remote areas of the Zamunda, and of course I never forced somebody to sell something. I always paid the prices. Yeah, but for the Zamunda, it was so difficult to get cash at this time, so it was really not clear if they say, okay, I'm not interested in my old objects anymore, or they say, oh my God, this is my only chance to get some cash for other important things. Yeah? And I was a very young curator and very naive, and the instructions from my director was like, okay, you have some money and try to get as much pieces. And when I start not working only on my ethnographic field in Amazonia, but also start more about museum studies, and also with our projects from the European Union like Rime and Switch, it really changed my mind. Yeah? And now I'm another person looking back on what I did before. And I think for some of my colleagues, this was like a little bit going too far, yeah, into this discussion. Really look at what we are doing, yeah. But I think this is very important if we really want to create some kind of a post-colonial museum. The other thematical areas are how we are dealing with sacred objects, because some of the sacred objects are not allowed to be shown to the public. But of course, this is a very interesting point. Objects are very important to understand the culture. And we found a way in this exhibition to show sacred objects, but so people cannot see them. They are in the exhibition, but they are covered, so it's not possible to see them. And for me, this is a very important reason, because then people learn to accept borders of other cultures. And respecting other cultures is also to respect the borders and things that are refused to us. And the other is about repatriation. It's a very interesting case in Austria that in the 1980s, the repatriation to the Maori from the Te Papa Museum of some human remains were just possible because when there was an exchange between the museum and the Austrian got another object. And 3 years ago, it was totally d'accord that we gave back the human remains without expecting something in what we are getting. So here you can see a view in the gallery. We have a multimedia touch table where we have 10 other points to explore for the visitor. There we are also asking questions about, for example, neo-extractivism, about slavery, and we give some more information and material to investigate other collections. In the other galleries, for example, we have some galleries dealing explicit with colonialism, like the gallery Benin and Ethiopia, Power, Art and Resistance, where we show that, for example, the Benin collection came in a very, of course, in a colonial context to our museum, and a lot of these pieces were looted by the British. And on the other side, the collection from Ethiopia came as gifts, as gift exchange between the Haile Selassie, the king of Ethiopia, and the Austrian emperor. A big discussion right now is about the colonial history of the Munduruku, how it is shown in our museum, because the Munduruku were headhunters in the early 19th century, collaborative partners of the Brazilian against other indigenous communities. And so it was important for us to show this part of the history. And with the Munduruku, we had the chance to speak for them. It's totally fine to show their past as headhunters in a European museum. My conclusion word is that we are talking a lot about how we are dealing with colonialism in exhibition, but I think we also need to go deeper into the structure of ethnographic museums, like our database, which is totally organized by our categories. We are still in this, when we are putting them online, sometimes we are still repeating stereotypes, and I think we also need to look closer in the structure, because sometimes I have the impression that the regional organization of our museum by departments for Africa, for East Asia, for South America is creating little kingdoms where the curator is giving access or not to other people. And I know that some of our curators still have the problem with a participatory museum to give access to people who not study for a long time anthropology or not working for a long time in a museum. And by the end, also our budgets, in the case of Vienna, are reflecting that there is a lot of budget for curators traveling around the world, and there is more or less no budget to invite people from afar connected with our collections and to work with them. And so when we talk about colonialism, I think we really need to look also at the structure and the inside of our museums. Thank you very much.